Okay, and we are live. Exciting. So we are very excited to get started on this right away. With in our world with growing inequality, many school districts and many regions are already talking about what can we do to catch up students who are behind. And that's exactly why we are so excited to bring in educational coach and Rev Up Robotics author George Valenzuela. He'll give us some of the key questions that we need to relate in even the most difficult situations. And he'll give us that emotional foundation as the author of the SEL in Action Guide. And you'll find many of these items are available on Amazon as well. So I'll plug that to begin with. But I think you're going to start to see a lot more stuff from him. And so, without further ado, I want to give George a little bit, ask him maybe some questions just to begin with. Like, how did you get to this point? Like, I mean, at this point, you're guiding people, you're coaching people, but I imagine like what struggle did you have to overcome that made you decide that like being a coach is the right thing for me?
Well, first, good morning, Dr. Ed. It's a pleasure to be with you. I know we met
Likewise.
recently at Q at the authors panel, but I've seen you somewhere, and I think I've seen you around ISTE and other places. So it's a pleasure to be here. For me, it all really began in the classroom. I did not plan on being a teacher initially. I got talked into it. And so I didn't become a teacher right away. I substituted for a little while, but I entered a summer school program where I was working with young people. And so one of the things that I really struggled with in computer programming was pre-calculus and calculus, statistics, all of that math stuff. And so I had to get special help. And at the time, I was very naive, meaning that I would think that if I'm struggling with something, then no one else is, it's only me. And so when I graduated and I got into the classroom, I realized that a lot of young people also struggled with, other subjects, meaning they weren't able to really find the purpose in it, and they could not connected to anything in their life. And so therefore they weren't emotionally compelled to want to put in the work or even know where to start. And so that willingness or that wanting to help other people is what really put me on my current path. First in the classroom, then as an administrator. As an administrator, I was responsible, or as an instructional coach, which at the district level where I was working, it's an administrator. I was responsible for the CNI, or the curriculum and instruction needs of 40 teachers.
Wow.
And so, yeah, and so it was for engineering and for STEM and for computer science. So the same way that I wanted to help my learners, I wanted to help my teachers. And so I realized that I had to become what I want to see in the classroom, which meant that I had to improve my instructional design practices for teaching and learning. And what that means is how I plan lessons and how I teach them. And that, that passion, that wanting to help eventually made me an expert in CNI. And so I would say in that role for 9 years, I started to write about my experiences, and I started to do a lot of workshops around the country. I never thought that I would be doing it at this level now. And yeah, it was just more in wanting to help other people overcome things that I overcame first.
So I love that, what you just mentioned, George, because so often we talk about like do as I say, not as I do. And we don't live the experience of, I've got to do, and I got to become the person that I want I want you to aspire to be. I need to show with my actions that this is who I am and that this is what I am capable of doing and this is what I expect of you. Having high expectations of others is one thing, but we also need to start with high expectations of ourselves. And so I appreciate I thank you so much for sharing that because I think that that is so, so important.
Yeah, like I've never felt in my life like I arrived at somewhere. I always feel like I'm a work in progress. I always feel like I'm always learning. Like I really put myself each day in the mindset of being a beginner. Of course, I start with experience, but also as a learner. So no matter who I'm speaking to, whether it's a participant in the workshop, whether it's a student at my university, whoever it is, I'm always learning. And I think
Mm.
that when you're in a lead role, like in a leadership role, like as a teacher or as a coach, leading means to go first. It doesn't mean to delegate. It doesn't mean to say, like what you just said, I expect you to do this. No, it means modeling and showing them. And so people, I have found, especially educators, we really resent when the PD person doesn't have any actual experience in what they're coaching. That's a big problem. And so I realized very early on that I have to become what I want to see in classrooms and also the world. And so that's where I start from every day.
Oh man, I appreciate that so much because that's exactly what we need is we need to rethink how we model, right? Because like people see they don't necessarily listen to what we say, they look at what we do and then they follow that because what we say and what we do is often not the same and you're definitely like the exact opposite of that.
Yeah,
Now,
well, I have a son and daughter, and they have told me that we don't really listen a lot to what you say, but we're looking at everything you do. And they told
mm,
me that they started to notice everything I do around middle school.
mm, wow.
And I didn't know that. And so I'm so glad that I was on this path.
You know what? I see this not just middle school, I see this my own kids as well. I have a 5-year-old and 7-year-old, and they talk about, like, my own behaviors in front of screens, and you're like, "Don't tell me to do these things around screens unless you're gonna do it as well." And this is why I go this whole, like, "Oh, no screen time," and whatever, like, if you are not practicing a no screen time type of practice, don't you do not ask that of your kids. Don't ask them to do
Well,
things that you wouldn't do as well. I think
yeah.
that that is so, so key. And so what I wanted to do, to begin with, which I thought is a fun way of, like, getting started is to start, introducing the topic that we're, talking about today. So we're talking about children who thrive. And I think that
Mhm.
this topic is very important. It's very relevant for today. Things are changing so much, in our world, and so it is important to for us to describe that and really just to figure out what is it that we need. And I think the first question that we have, and I something that I've been very curious about, has been questions. So we want to relate, obviously, with our own kids, but we gotta do that by asking relevant questions. Like, we gotta ask them something that they care about. And I
Mhm.
often struggle with this myself to go, "Well, how do I show? How do I show in the questions that I ask them that this is important to me, this is important to them?" And so maybe you can describe, like, what are the questions that help us relate by asking?
Yeah. So for me, first, and I'm not even talking about pedagogy right now, right? Like I'm talking about who I am as a person. I have to be relatable. Um, Dr. Rita Pearson said, rest in peace, a long time ago, that young people don't learn from people that they don't like. And so I think it's important that we appear in a way that we are, relatable, and that we show that we actually care and that we love our students. And so I know that, love is a feeling. Well, it's a feeling, and it fluctuates. But Dr. Stephen R. Covey said in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People that love is also a verb. It's an action that you do, even when you're not feeling it at the moment. It's unconditional, no matter what. And so if students see us as a person that cares about them, even if we are from a different background or we have a different culture or we're from a different race, that love and care, I believe, appeals to the humanity in each and every person. Now,
Yeah.
as far as pedagogy goes, I think that it's important to involve our children in thinking routines and intellect. See, if your work in the classroom is not intellectually challenging, right? Then how else are young people going to learn how to think and how to solve problems? You know,
Yeah, we do all the thinking for them. Why do we
right,
need to do any thinking, right?
right. According to Mander, thinking is skilled work. It's not something that you're born, that you can logically learn how to think on your own. It has to be taught. And so typically in schools, what we hear about is blooms. And so I do agree that most of the thinking routines or the frameworks for teaching kids how to think are derived from blooms. There's also other ones. So I think that a teacher needs to really think about what would be a great problem solving strategy or thinking framework for what they teach. So I'm a computer science teacher, so I use computational thinking first as a framework, which after repetition it becomes a mindset, and that's how problems are solved in computer programming and in network design. So if I'm a social studies teacher, I would probably consider, design thinking. If I'm a science teacher, I would think of inquiry-based protocols for experiments, observations, things like that. So I think it's important to have routines. Now, when I'm in a workshop, I focus on three main verbs: analysis, synthesis, evaluation. And so what I do is this: I have all of my participants either look at a picture, a video, or some informational text. And I want them to analyze, and I let them know right now we are doing analysis. And then I ask them, what do you see? What do you think? What do you wonder? Where are you stuck? So after they've analyzed and they have an idea, then they can design, or they can synthesize, or they can synthesize and make an artifact. And then evaluation, I use reflection for metacognition. Because like John Dewey said, we do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. And so for me, it's not just about being, relatable, which is the first part, I think, but it's also about engaging them in learning. So you make them a learning partner first, and then you teach them the algorithms that they need in order to solve problems. Because that's really teaching someone how to fish. And then they can do it on their own, after they leave your class.
So, okay, I love this, because what you're saying is, like, we're not learning by experience, we're learning by reflecting on the experience. And to me,
Yeah.
this is a key point, is that we often experience life and we just run through it and we do no reflection whatsoever. And to me, this is the key to relating. And I'm also curious, like, okay, this is the hardest part. It's just getting that conversation started, is asking that first question. So to me, I like going back to that theme that we had earlier, like, what is that one question that we would ask, potentially the one that says, yeah, like, I care about you and I care about, like, reflection and those kind of things. Like, how do I even get that, if I'm hesitant as a parent, how do I get
Mhm.
that conversation started? And I guess it was like, maybe it's just like one sentence, like, it's those one single questions that you ask that it makes it like,
Yeah.
oh, it's super clear. This is exactly why.
Well, I like to ask my kids, even my wife, and even like my participants, I always ask them, what are 3 takeaways? And what are 3 things that you would do differently? And that's like my, sentence starter. And so what I'm looking to do as a teacher is to activate HOTS, higher order thinking skills, right? They don't know that, but that, I want them to think about their own thinking and to think about what their experience is. Now, for adults, what I have found is that you talk about things that we've all seen. Some of us have experienced, but we've all seen. So I'll say something like, well, has anyone ever been into a bar or into a nightclub? And a lot of people say, yeah, I've been in there, I've been there. So I say, okay, now you see a lot of people having fun, but by the end of the night, you'll always see one person who's either like this, right, at the bar, at the end of the bar, or on the pavement. And if you eavesdrop, that person is always saying, I'm never going to do that again. But they end up the next Friday night doing it again. And so what psychologists say is that in that moment, they mean it. But because they didn't reflect appropriately on the natural consequence of the behavior to self and to others, they're doomed to repeat this over and over again. And so what I do with my child, who's 15 now, is, I don't tell him that story, but I bring up, situations he's been involved in, like where he went somewhere where he shouldn't be going, or he did something, and I just say, hey, what is your takeaway? And also what we have to understand is that that the cortex, in the brain, it needs to connect with another part of the brain that enables reasoning and critical thinking. And so that doesn't really fully develop until 25 years old. So that's why I'm saying we have to provide our children thinking frameworks that can eventually turn into mindsets. Wow. Because you can't do it on your own. That's what science says. Now, I'm not saying everyone can't do it on their own, but, I know I couldn't. Once I had a system for solving problems, then I think I was unstoppable. Like as far as learning goes, it's like being in the kitchen and I have to make lasagna for the very first time. I need a recipe. If I don't have a recipe, then what can I do? And so when I learned about project-based learning, I learned it through evidence-based instructional strategies and vetted educational protocols. And so I was doing workshops like that for 5 years, using strategy after strategy. It was like a recipe. So eventually I became an expert. That's how learning happens. Tony Robbins says, repetition is the mother of skill. Aristotle said, you are what you do repeatedly. And so once I got into the PhD program, then it was a little different, because then I learned how learning actually happens, meaning I learned the theoretical frameworks and the learning theories that informed those practices. But prior to, I couldn't tell you why they worked. I could just tell you that I can show you that they do work. And so I think it's really a tandem of both. And if educators are fortunate enough to work in a school where they operate as PLCs and they're doing book studies and they're learning the research behind the practices that their school is asking them to do, then I think we have a win-win. If not, then I think it's very difficult to achieve something that we don't fully understand.
So what I heard from you there was that, and I think this is like so important, and I just want to emphasize it, is like we are what we do repeatedly, and we often don't repeat enough of the things that we do. And I think it's that building that habit. And so what's happening is people are saying things, but they're not following up with action. So who is the person? Who is the person that follows up with that action, right? Like if it's the parent or if it's the teacher, like who's going to hold them accountable? And that's the thing, is like we live in a world without accountability these days, like everybody is just, I want to say, they do stuff. If you do it or you don't do it. This is one of the big challenges I had with my son and his class. Yo, you had a question.
Yeah, well, so I don't have an answer for that. That's the only thing that I don't have an answer for that. The only thing I can do is be accountable for myself. I heard Tupac say this in an interview. I can't answer for anyone else, but I can answer for me. And so I have a neighbor, and my neighbor, he's always giving me books to read. And one day, a few years ago, he was like, "Man, you have to read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers." And he said, if you don't want to read the whole thing, just read one chapter on a very important concept. It's called the 10,000 hour rule. And so just in a nutshell, in the book, he talks about people that are at the top of their field. People like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Michael Jordan, Michael Jackson, Justin Bieber, not that all these folks are in the book, but folks that, that are at the top of their fields. The thing they have in common is the 10,000 hour rule, meaning that for 10 years, they dove into their topic for 3 hours a day, 20 hours a week, and maybe even more. And so when I found that out, I treated my work like an NBA game. Like if I know that I'm doing a workshop and that workshop is for 90 minutes, I rehearsed that 90 minutes 14, 15 times before I even got there. And I got that from Michael Jordan. There's a book called Relentless. It's by Tim Grover. And that's what he talks about.
Sorry, The Landless?
It's called Relentless, yeah.
Relentless, yeah.
And so think about the analogy of the workshop being 90 minutes. Well, if an NBA game is 43 minutes, Michael would practice 45 minutes or 90 minutes 3 times a day. So by the time he got to the game, he already played the game 15 times. And so for him, everything is slowed down, it's slow motion. And for everyone else, it's going fast and anxiety is building in. And so it's very important to, get control of your emotions, right? Because we all have them. And that only happens through practice and repetition.
Oh, I love that. So we have a few people who are on the call right now. And, Roger asked a question. Maybe I'll see if I can bring it up here. Can you speak to the rituals and routines children 0 to 5 balancing, mastering skills and creativity? Any suggestions there for Roger?
Well, I haven't taught children that young, except my own children. And so the thing that I've done with them is, I focus a lot on being very mindful of what I'm saying to them. There's a book called The Four Agreements. It's by Don Miguel Ruiz. And he said that when people hear things, they either agree or they disagree. But when you're young, you tend to agree with everything, unfortunately. And so it's important to tell your child, positive things, right? You are doing a good job. You can do anything that you do if you put your mind to it. You are smart, right? Things like that. But I think focus on like I know, like me, like with like my young children, I made sure that they can cut on a straight line, that they can use a ruler, that they knew where to find things that, in order to learn. But I would really focus on having them think through things. And I can't remember that far, but I think that what we do in computer science is we have maker spaces and we allow them to tinker at a young age. And tinkering allows young people to, play with things and explore them in such a way that they start to see patterns. For example, if they're playing with electronics and they are clicking on a switch, they start to see, input, output. Now, they don't make all these connections, but that eventually happens. Also, video games. Now, I know that for small kids, I forgot what we had, things on the iPad and things like that. But I think it's important that it's a tandem of telling them things that we should be saying to them, positive things, right? Helping them through their difficult emotions, but also in having them explore and play. And tinkering, I don't think is what we need to do as they get older as much, but I think it's a great intro into learning concrete skills. And I
love
hope that
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 so
was
much,
helpful.
George.
Yeah, I hope that that's helpful. I never
Yeah.
taught from 0 through 5, so.
Let us know if it was helpful. And in the meantime, maybe I can add that, to me, I love this, especially for the 0 to 5 years old. I found that they're constantly looking for approval, right? And so if you can tell them like, wow, you did this thing and it was so good. Like, I am so proud of you for doing this. They need constant encouragement and constant positive direction. And they often, do they get it from home? Do they get it like do they get it from school? Maybe the teachers in their class are too busy to give praise to every single individual. You need to be there to give some of that praise on a regular basis. So building a habit of going, certain things that I love to see from you are going to
Mhm.
receive praise is such a powerful, powerful way of getting them towards like the kinds of behaviors, kind of habits, the kinds of the practice that you said, that those 10,000 hours, the Malcolm Gladwell hours, that those are really, really key. I was gonna also think that that relates so well to the second point that you had, and I wanted to see if we can transition to that one.
No problem.
And that's this one. It's like we talk about the foundation, right? There's this foundation of this emotional foundation. And I think that like when we're talking about academics, we often say, oh, they need to catch up. Maybe they're behind in this subject. But unless we deal with the emotional foundation, it feels like there's just no way that these kids are even going to start to catch up. Like we're talking summer school and stuff. How are we going to even build that foundation for them so that we know that they're going to be able to succeed in this type of scenario? Right? So
Well,
what kind of basic foundation do they need?
I think it's learning how to think and how to problem solve. So there's two types of knowledge that people need in order to think critically. There is procedural knowledge, right? Systematic steps, like think mathematics. Mathematics is it's a sequence of algorithmic steps or algorithmic steps that you take in a sequence in order to solve a problem. If you don't know what that procedure is, then you're going to get stuck and you might quit, right? So that's one thing. So it's some procedural knowledge, but there's declarative knowledge, knowing facts, okay? And so I think that we have to meet people where they are.
Wait. So help me understand that. Like, what's the difference between procedural knowledge and like facts? Like, what is the distinction here, and what does that do?
Okay. So all right. So declarative knowledge are facts. Okay, and procedural knowledge are the steps for problem solving, are the steps that you would take, like, on procedures, procedural knowledge. Does that make sense?
Okay, so like one is just like the facts, the solution, and then the other one is how do you get to the solution?
Right, so that's why I said earlier, engage them in frameworks for thinking. When you teach someone how to think, then there is no learning loss. Then there is no, they know what to do, or they know how to find the answer.
Right.
And so I think that is what we need to do. And so, and the same thing goes for our emotions. I wrote an article before the pandemic, I believe. And, it's the algorithm for being able to work through your emotions. Number one is you need to know what emotions are. Two, you need to know how to identify them, right? Recognize them. And third, you have to find strategies for, regulating. So if I'm a teacher, one thing I can do is I can do an emotions check-in. And the check-in can be a formative assessment that I can do it in regards to whatever my learning goal is that day in the classroom, whatever our final product is, or maybe something is happening in our children's lives. If we give them an algorithm, here's a check-in, then you label. I like to use Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions because it helps learners see that there's 8 basic emotions and that other emotions are an amalgamation of those in tandem with with other ones. And then once they start to recognize and label what they're experiencing, then finding a strategy for self-regulation, it's a lot easier, right? And so I just think that focusing on routines, on systematic approaches, frameworks is very important. And I think that as a teacher, well, as a coach, that has helped me tremendously because my learners always know where we are in the steps. And sometimes you can't solve a problem right away, but like as we know in STEM, it's not always about the final product. It's about the knowledge that's learned or is constructed or built upon along the way. And I think that's equally important. So if we are incorporating or embedding reflection for metacognition throughout each activity, then there's never a learning loss.
You know, I love this. I'm going to add up like something I just wrote down. Name it to tame it, right? Like that's what we're talking about. That's the name of the game, right? Like being able to speak to those emotions, man. Like being able to have an emotional type of literacy. This is the thing is we are so literate on writing, reading, you know, arithmetic, but how literate are we with respect to our own emotions? Like we think like, oh, okay, you know, I just feel stuff. I'm just angry, sad. I'm like, no. Do you know the 8 emotions? Oh, just, and by the way, I'm going to ask you, like, maybe you can just quickly go through some examples of like the examples of the names and some examples of how you get that started, because this is the hard part for a lot of parents is they don't know, like, how do I even get started with this? And you know how there's some people talk about like an anger ladder, right? Like, you know, there's different stages and people use like characters or something. Like, I would love to know, like, what do people use to develop this emotional literacy?
And so one thing I have to say is this, is that when it comes to helping young people, their emotions, whether you're a teacher or a parent, you can't take a lead learner approach on this one. So in computer science, we have this thing or this mindset, even in STEM, that the teacher is the lead learner. And I think code.org may have coined that, or they've lifted it up in, you know, on their website or some article. And so that makes sense because, you know, I want to say most, I could be wrong, but most of the computer science and STEM teachers don't have a background in engineering or in CS. And so they're teaching something that's out of their wheelhouse. And so, yeah, they are going to have to learn alongside with their children. However, I think that that's true, but when it comes to coding and things like that, these are earned skills. Thinking is skilled work. It's not something that you inherit. You're not naturally endowed with this. And the same thing goes with mastering emotions. Like if you look at young people, I think little kids are more in tune with their emotions because they're present with their emotions. And I, you know, learned this through Eckhart Tolle's work. In his book, A New Earth, he says that if you observe a child or even a duck, all right, let's start with the duck. If 2 ducks are having an argument and you see them in the pond, right, they have their thing and then very quickly it ends and they fly into, or they swim into different directions and they shake it off and they move on. And so he says that if you look at a young child, they're very present with their emotions and they cry, scream, kick, whatever they have to do. But then after 15, 20 minutes, they're back playing again. What happens is
so you're saying like we eventually learn to suppress our own emotions, and that's why we're so disconnected. That's why we've got all these like problems today.
Okay, so I can't go that far, but you know, I can just go on my personal experiences. If young people don't have a conscious adult that knows what emotions are, knows how to label and recognize and manage, then for their own defense or for their own protection, because everyone gets hurt emotionally, you know, some worse than others, but they block it out as a defense mechanism. Unfortunately, if we don't learn how to feel it to heal it, if we don't learn that, then it doesn't really go away, and then it's stored trauma. There's emotional trauma, there is psychological trauma, which sometimes we need some help with, but regardless, it doesn't really go away. And so the thing is this: the adult can't be the lead learner. The adult has to do that inward, outward work, that self work on themselves to then be able to engage and coach.
Huh.
You can't help someone understand themselves, their environment, and other people if you yourself don't understand yourself. And so that's why we have SEL and we have these things in schools. But I think it's important that parents and educators also do that work first on themselves. And so when we have a tool like Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions or even emojis, and we're helping young people see, hey, there's anger, there is pain, there's anticipation, there is joy. I know that for me, one of the biggest aha moments, as a younger person, I always felt that I had to respond to every situation. I'm from Queens, Far Rockaway, Queens in New York. And if someone said something or looked at me in a certain way, part of the culture there was that we meet that head on and we addressed it immediately. And so the thing is, as I got older and I started to move into different spaces where that didn't really happen, it wasn't part of the culture, like, university, work, it was frowned upon. That was no longer a strength because it wasn't always done in the right way. And so, I didn't know any better.
That level of control is so important. I remember, like,
Right.
even our own school, like, we had an incident where, like, one student could email, like, the entire school, and we've got a lot of students in our school. Like, ours is a 10X school, so we've got 5,600 students just in our one online school alone. And so you could send, like, an email to every student in the school, and people were so angry. They're like, "Stop sending these messages!" And they're like, it's a K-9 school, so they're really young. And my message to them was, you know what? If anyone on the internet, and this is the thing about the internet, it's like it causes people to be angry a lot. And if you react in anger, right? Like, if you're going to react because, like, you got angry about something, then pretty much anyone on the internet can control you. And it takes time to develop that self-control, that self-discipline, that regulation that people have. And before we move on, because you mentioned feel it to heal it, and that's our next section. But I want to, before we do that, answer one more question from Roger. This is a little bit longer one. I hope it'll fit. He says, thank you. Very helpful. In some cultures, praising young children is less of a focus, and high achievement and humble attitudes are stressed. Is there a way to encourage young children to achieve but stay humble, but also encourage them specifically? And there's more. I can't really fit the rest in it. But it says specifically our experience raising children in the U.S. or Chinese multicultural communities, bringing into contrast two different cultural traditions in achievement and finding creativity, finding a balance on that journey is very dynamic. It's a great question, Roger.
Yeah. So, all right. So, Roger, I can only answer that from my own perspective, right? And so, one of the things that I did with my child, I did provide praise where he deserved it, right? But I focused more on bit of encouragement as he was growing up. And there was one time that I found out that he teased another kid at school because something that the kid was wearing. And so what I did with my child, I took him to where I'm from, Far Rockaway, Queens in New York, and into the projects, that I had experience walking through as a kid. And I took him on my street. I showed him all of these things. And I basically, for him being humble, I taught him this. You were born on third base, but you didn't hit the triple. You didn't really earn that. Like privilege or whatever you have, you've had to earn that. So you don't really have the right to treat anyone in the wrong way. And so I think that for parents that are raising children that are in a different context than we were, I think to keep them humble, right? I think we need to show them where we started and show them what the possibilities are, and to focus on, of course, on achievement, on being smart, on solving problem strategies, little recipes, but also on understanding that the things they do for themselves, their achievements, right? These should be tied to their passions, things that they care about, But they should take those passions and flip them in service of others to help other people. So if you're trying to help people, you're not going to be looking down on them. And so I think that is one of the things that I try to instill, not just in my participants or in my own children, but I think everyone should, is to find out what you like to do, something you would do every day, become an expert at it, that 10,000 hour rule, but then flip it and turn it into a purpose for helping other people. And I think that will keep anyone grounded.
I love it as well. And you can see like Roger's already like responding to this one. It's like, yeah, but you're like, you don't understand your privilege until you bring them into that context, that you can show them, like, you don't understand, like, this is how difficult it is for some others. And giving them that context of like, you have to understand this is where you come from. And you're talking about humility. It's like humility comes from understanding, like, where did we come from? Everybody who says like, oh, I've made it, but I still remember where I came from. Where did you come from? What does that mean? And I think that's it's so key. You're hitting it on the nail, like here. I love it.
Well, and that's one part, but the other part is that we have to teach our kids about empathy. And I know that empathy is often, defined by putting yourself in someone's shoes. I don't know if that's possible, but I think we can learn to see the perspective of another person, that we validate what their position is. It doesn't mean we agree with them. It doesn't mean that we subscribe to it, but it means that we try to understand where they are coming from. And I heard a young person say in a video from the Bronx, New York, that if everyone had empathy for each other, we'd all be friends. There's a quote that I heard once, that there isn't a person you wouldn't love if you just heard what his or her story is. And so I just think that, teaching our kids about empathy and trying to see from someone's, point of view, I think it goes a long way in making them, better people.
So I love this, and I think we're now into the last section, because we're starting to talk about, and some of the questions from Roger really relate to this, is feeling it to heal it, right? So like experiencing the emotion, moving into that, I think is really relevant, because the question that I want to highlight from Roger is, there's this balance that he talked about, like, could you speak to the balance of learning emotional expression with emotional control for younger children? Maybe you can speak to that, because on one side, we're saying we want you to have really great emotional control, and on the other side, it's like, no, we want you to like feel and experience these emotions. What is the balance between these two? It's a great question, Roger. Well, what do you think, George?
Well, as far as emotional control goes, I don't know about that, because I still haven't been able to, control all of my emotions. But, it goes back to our first question. So first, I didn't say feel it to heal it. And so the one thing that I found in my life is that I didn't treat emotional pain the same way that I did physical pain. So an example of that is this. If I'm playing basketball and I twist my ankle, right? The right thing to do is to get it checked out, is to rehab it, sit on the bench, don't play on the ankle. Let the ankle heal. And so the same thing goes when we experience emotional pain. Sometimes that pain is so great that if we, don't meet it head on, and we get the therapy we need, we take the time we need, we let time, time heals. We talk about what's happened. If someone has hurt us, then we can seek some restorative justice, right? Well, for me, I had to learn that feelings precede emotions, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
First is the
Yeah, I
emotion,
know what you mean. Yeah.
first is the emotion, then is the feeling, then there's either the reaction or the response. And so when I was younger, even as an adult, I was reacting to my emotions and my feelings. And even now that I'm a lot better, I still have days, but now I know how to regroup and get myself back on track. Right. And it's more difficult when our rights, our civil rights are violated.
Mhm.
When we are being um, underrepresented, marginalized, when we see our own people being mistreated, that's very difficult to do. And so I don't think that anyone can tell anyone how to feel,
Right.
right? But I know that for me, I have found that I'm a lot better when I'm emotionally in control or in better control. And so sometimes I'll be honest, just like last week, there was a lot in the news that was just too emotional. Twitter, it was
Yeah.
too much to handle. And I
Yeah.
couldn't be in the right frame of mind. I had to cancel a class and be like, look, guys, we just can't do it today. Like, it's just not, something. But I think that, young people as well as adults need to know um, what they can or cannot handle, when they
Mhm.
know when they need that, emotional rest or break. But at the same time, I think we have to work on it so that we can be better prepared to help our young people with this, because it doesn't go away.
Powerful.
It's not going away. Like, I think
Yeah.
that we can start over with a whole different country, civilization, language, but emotions are still going to be there. So
Okay, so how did you know this? Like, so you're describing the situation of last week. You totally knew that you couldn't run this class. Like, at what point do you go like, it's above the threshold, right? Like, and I am not able to know, and I'm able to know that truly, like, I need that time. I need time away. I need to be doing something different. I'd love to
yeah,
hear your thoughts about how do you know? How do you get to that point?
when my anxiety level starts to go up and I feel like my heart is pounding and I'm not able to quickly regroup. Now there is a trick that I use, and it's Dr. Wayne Dyer talks a lot, or in his work he talks about meditation, and so breathing is a
Mhm.
big part of that. And so if you take 3 simple breaths, it stops. See, by focusing on breathing, you can no longer focus on your thinking, right? And so that's like a pattern
Right.
interrupt. And so typically that's what I do. But when I can't just do that, right? And I, know that I'm upset or that I'm anxious or that then I know that I need to take a break, because I don't want to say or do anything that's not going to be constructive. I think we're either building or we are destroying. And so I never want to be in a position where I'm not saying the right things to my students or other people. And so yeah, I take a break. Um, there's times you have to get
Wow.
on social media. I mean, it's important, man. Yeah. I mean, like
I
they
love this. Like, you've got this notion of emotions. Like, there's a physiological component to it, right? Like,
oh,
emotion, there is a movement of our body in doing it. It's a heart rate
oh
that's increased. It is something else. And I think that to me is key. Like, if you notice your heart rate is going up, you notice your, like, emotional level is, like, way up there. You've got way more anxiety, you're shorter with people. Like, this is a good indication. Like, you gotta get this under control. Like, you maybe need that time. Meditation, you might need that time for, like, rest if you're not having enough sleep. And that's another thing as well. It's like, oh man, like, I don't know what um this time has done
Yeah.
for sleep patterns, but it's been insane.
Oh yeah, no, like, yeah, I don't sleep anymore. No, but I'll say this though: when when it's very difficult for me to empathize with someone, then I know I have to love them at a distance.
What do you mean by that? What's like love them at a distance? Tell me.
Well, I think that, um, as a person of faith, we have to love people. We don't love all that they do, obviously, but we have to love them. And so, having empathy is to see it from someone else's point of view. Well, if your point of view is killing me and damaging me, then I just have to love you at a distance. That's just how, I prefer to go. You just can't be in every situation. It just doesn't work that way, in my opinion. And so when anytime I take time, if I don't know about something, I learn about the history of it. I learn about what I need to know. And if I just can't, then I just can't. So that's how I try to be.
Yeah, yeah. Like that's a key point. There is sometimes we need to know when do we react and when do we step away. And I think that having that type of emotional self-control is just so important. Having that type of regulation. And yeah, you're right. You do want to feel it. And it's just being able to recognize our own emotions to the point where we know that if I start reacting or if I go into the live situation with this, I'm going to be running in way hot. I'm going to be I'm going to be reacting negatively. I'm going to be like really like angry with people. It's like, I
Hey,
feel it too.
can
Yeah,
I
go for
drop
it.
something in the chat? Is there a way for me to drop something in the chat?
Yeah, absolutely. Is there something you wanted me to highlight?
Yeah, well, there's an article I wrote on 3 ways that educators can better manage their emotions.
Yeah,
And
see
I
if you
think it
can, like,
even,
you should be able to pop stuff in and it should appear in all the different platforms.
okay, so let me see. For some reason, it's not allowed. So it says I can private chat. Okay, so look, I'm
Oh,
going to
okay.
send it
Private
over
chat
to
to
you.
me and then I'll send it.
Yeah, and so that,
Oh, sweet.
yeah, those steps are pretty much universal. And yeah, parents can also work on those too. Okay, and there's a lot more to all of that, but in blogs, we typically do 900 to 1,000 words, but there's also work by Dr. James Gross out of Stanford. And so he's an emotions researcher, and his work, he has a process model for emotion regulation. And so his work helped me because sometimes you can change what you respond to emotionally because feelings come after the emotions. And so you can decide to, give that thing importance or not give it importance. And so, one of the things that I used to emotionally respond negatively to is when my friends would not support me or would not be happy for me if something was going my way. And so I had to learn how to change my response to that emotion. And now I just realized that that's not really about me at all. That's really more about them, more than me. It
Okay, so
says
wait,
more.
so this link, and I appreciate you mentioning that because like this is a good example. So the link you had was 3 steps to better manage emotions.
Yeah.
And like we'll leave a link, and I apologize for those. I can't leave a link right now, but you will get it at least after this chat. I'll copy everything. But I guess my question is, what are those 3 steps? What are the 3 steps that better help manage our emotions?
Yeah. So we've been talking about it the whole time, is to know what emotions are and their effect on the body and on you as a person, on your decisions. Know that feelings come after the emotion, right? And then second is what psychologists say the first step should be, is to label and to recognize. And then third is to regulate. And so Dr. James Gross's work is in there. There's a video in there and his model. And that's actually what I teach in my SEL masterclass as the first step for educators before they even do this with the kids, right? Because you can't be the lead learner on this one. And so, but even with that said, though, I'm not perfect, and we can't expect anyone else to be perfect. And so when we learn about these things and we're doing better. Sometimes because, things are habit, right? We might fall back into the same pattern of reactions. But as long as we catch ourselves, then that's a step in the right direction. And it takes time, so we need to, try not to judge ourselves or others that we're working with. Lead with love, lead with grace, and just do the best that we can do. Like, we're living in a very difficult time right now. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, we were just biting our nails after seeing a video of proof to find out if someone was guilty or not. That's the type of time that we live in. So we can just do the best that we can, take care of ourselves, our families, our students, our children, and do it for the right reasons.
Exactly. And that's a really great point that I wanted to emphasize, because you teach a course specifically about this, and I wanted to give some opportunity to plug both the course, your training, and the SEL in Action Guide. But before that,
Yeah.
we've got a question that I wanted to see if I can highlight. I don't know if it'll all fit in here. Give me a sec. So he asks, Roger asks, the emotional expression and meditation exhibits itself differently in body movements when we practice yoga, kung fu, and prayer. Can you speak to how movement connects to emotions more given these various practices?
Yeah, so I
Great
know
question.
that happens a lot in Tai Chi, in yoga, and even in prayer. For me, it's more of a focus on my breathing and clearing my mind. And so one practice that I try to do after doing something where I do some heavy mental lifting, like my writing or workshop, or even physical activity like a workout, is to take 5 minutes to just, clear my head, focus on my breathing, and just allow for there to pattern interrupt between thinking and breathing, right? Another strategy that I've been working on is you do 90 minutes of work and then you take 20-minute break to do that, right? And to do something
Like a
completely.
Pomodoro type of effect then.
Yeah. And so one of the ways that I have found that has helped me is laughter. And so I'm a big Martin Lawrence fan. And so the Martin Show, Golden Girls,
I love it.
I find shows that make me laugh. And I find that is a big stressor. So yeah, I know that different cultures have different things. But for me, I'm American. So I tend to go to the things that I like. And when you like something, when you do something you like to do, like for me is comedy, right? So, watch a comedy show, then you feel happy inside because you're doing something that you love. And I think that's really the first step to any type of internal peace.
Yeah, laughter is the best medicine when it comes to just I think we take ourselves too seriously sometimes. We're like, oh man, I've got to do this and I've got to have this accomplished. And it's like, does it really matter in the end? Like, it's more like laughter forces us to reflect. It forces us to think like, you know what, maybe it wasn't that big a deal. It's kind of funny. Like when I tell the story afterwards, and that kind of storytelling, like you get so many good things built in when you've got laughter there. And so I am so glad that you mentioned that. And to that, and I want to make sure that I don't forget, I would be remiss to not mention that George has a Twitter and your Instagram, my understanding, is the same.
Yeah.
George does PBL. PBL stands for Problem-Based Learning. And you're also the author of the SEL in Action Guide. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit about, because both of these are available, I think, on Amazon. So you've got the Rev Up Robotics book and you've got the SEL in Action Guide. Can you give us like a little preview of like what those are, if anybody is curious?
So all that we've been talking about in regards to social and emotional learning is work that I've been doing on my own, but also with one of my clients. We began the work. Well, we began curriculum and instruction work a couple of years ago, and so that's when I would coach, and work with them to help grow teachers, every month. And so when the pandemic happened, SEL became a big focus, not just in their school system, but in their state. Their state developed um, the instructional design practices for remote learning out of North Carolina framework.
Mm.
And so SEL and equity was part of that. And then other things that have happened in the country has forced us or has made us think about including other things into the work, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and things like that. And so anyway, I wrote a few articles on it, and ISTE, the International Society for Technology Education, is a publisher, which I wrote my previous book, Rep Up Robotics, which focuses on STEM, engineering, and computer science, and also computational thinking in the context of robotics. I wrote a guide for the framework that we developed for equity in SEL. And I also have partnered with Solution Tree, and we're working on a book for that, which is all the research, more practices, that's in the guide. Like the guide is just meant to provide you a framework for activating SEL in your lessons. It talks a lot about what we just discussed, not in all the detail that we just did or the same detail as the book. But anyway, I work with several school systems, and one teacher said, this is a masterclass, the equity and SEL thing. And so I turned it into a masterclass, which I put into the chat, my website, and you'll see
I'll drop
masterclass.
a link on that as
Yeah,
well
and
for
you'll
anybody
see,
who's missing it.
right, and you see that there's a bookstore, and so the SEL and action guides in there. All my other books are there as well. And so that's the work that I'm doing right now. I'm very proud of the work. I'm hoping that it helps other people. That's why we do it. And that's basically it.
Well, once again, George, I want to say honestly, like this has been so helpful because so much of what we do ignores this aspect of the social emotional learning, the component of we've got to deal with this first. We've got to make sure that our kids can't be good, and I think you've alluded to this as well. Our kids can't be good if we're not good. And, as
Yeah.
parents, like, this is one of the biggest challenges these days. I think as much as we talk about children and helping them thrive, it's also about helping the parent thrive. And we alluded to, like, there are situations where we need, as parents, to walk away. There are times where we, as parents, need that same level of tools to be able to describe our own emotions. We need that type of emotional literacy, and we often don't have it. Like, who taught us in school? What course did you take that was this? And I love how you described that it's a masterclass because
Yeah.
that's literally what it is a masterclass.
Well, also too, well, it's a lifelong masterclass, right? But also, if you look at the first article that I gave you, I share my story with emotional intelligence. And there's a book that I got. It's called Emotional Intelligence 2.0 by Dr. Travis
Yeah.
Bradbury and Gene Greaves. And so that book came with an appraisal, an EQ appraisal that I took, and I got a 74. And so it actually rates what the scores are. And that was a couple of years ago. And so one of the things is when you do reflection and you have thinking frameworks, remember those, right?
Yep.
When you have those, then you're not only focusing on your learning, but you're focusing on the gaps in learning and things that you don't know. And that's half the battle. It's like if a person has cancer, but he or she doesn't know they have cancer, then they can't get help. But if they know, they can get the help. And so that book, actually that book, I think they have done research and surveys with over 500,000 people. So you know it works. You know it
Yeah.
works. I mean, it's proven. And so having an appraisal for me was a game changer. The only thing that I think is that you have to want to do that work on yourself. For me, my biggest motivator was I didn't like feeling the way I was feeling. I didn't like feeling emotional pain. And I
Mm.
didn't know at the time that I was contributing to it.
Mm.
Not that everyone was doing it to me all the time. Yeah, things did happen. But sometimes I would repeat that. An
Wow.
example of that is this. It's like we talked about the ducks earlier. Eckhart Tolle says in his book that when two ducks, when they go in separate directions, they shake it off, the argument,
That's
and
right.
then it's over. So he says that if the duck had a human brain, then the mental movie that's happening in the brain of the duck would be, can you believe that other duck? All this pond, and he had to come on my side. Okay, you know what? The next time he comes over here, I'm going to show him. And I see him with his friends. I see him with all his duck friends, and I know they're talking about me. Watch.
Yeah.
Wait till next time. So,
Can you imagine, like, what kind of world would we live in, if like
and that's
ducks
what we
behave
do.
like people? And it just shows how silly it is, right? Like, but
Well,
it's so true. It's so true. That's like we spend so much time these days in our own thoughts because we are working from home, learning from home. We have more time than ever to think about these things, and that's why these social emotional controls that are out there are so important because we are going to react. We're going to react in a very negative way, or we're going to react and we're going to spend way more time thinking about it. Whereas if you were during your regular workday, you'd be so busy, you would never have time for that kind of stuff. Like you would just
but
like walk and move on.
but I do want to say one thing though.
Yeah.
That metaphor and that story is for me of the way I want to be, right? What I want to strive to is to be able to feel, recognize, and regulate. But we have to honor people where they are, and we can't penalize or judge others for where they are in their journey.
That's
All
true.
we can be is a model and be a friend. And people typically listen to their friends, not to people that they don't like, not to people that are on a high horse or on a soapbox. It just doesn't work that way. And so I try to withhold judgment. If there's a situation I just can't get with, I love it at a distance. But for the most part, I try to just lead by example and do the things that I think are important. And there's times that I'm wrong. There's times that I need to change my own perspective. And it happens a lot. And I think that if we're always learning, then we're always open to evolving and change.
Yeah. I wanted to add like this exact point because I feel like this is I think this is a key point that you added is I've had so many parents speak to me and say, I feel so guilty. My kids are spending so much time in front of screens. I feel like a terrible parent. My kid is falling behind. And one of my key message has been, well, I mean, nobody. It's not your fault, first of all, because nobody could have prepared you for. Oh, by the way, we're going to be locked down for like more than a year of this, and by the way, you're going to like be struggling. Like you suddenly have to go from basically a supporter of your kid's education to literally being the main partner. You probably spend more time with your kids, helping them, especially if they're learning from home. And so just noticing that we are all struggling through this right now, giving ourselves a break and saying, you know what, it's okay. You don't have everything figured out. You know what, we can forgive ourselves for, hey, there's more screen time than I would like. I think that this is all normal stuff, and that's this is why I've so appreciated this session. It's been like therapeutic for me. Like when I see all this, I'm like, like I feel this, as a dad, as a parent, it's like we don't talk about this side enough, and we need to talk about it more because we are always going to be struggling if we are not dealing with that. So, anyways, once again, quick plug. We are at the end of our time, but I think that this is really important. If you haven't picked up the SEL in Action Guide, please do so. Like, this is a useful resource for any parent that is using stuff these days. Follow George, check out his website. I put it into the chat. There's a lot of good stuff here. And once again, George, before we end, any last messages that you want to give out to the parents who are joining us today?
Yeah, so there's a quote by the late Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. I'm not sure if we all remember him or not.
Yep.
Yeah, but Mr. Rogers
My
was
favorite.
my first teacher. Yeah, he was my first teacher because my mom was a busy lady, and she wasn't always around, and so I'd be in front of the TV a lot. And so Mr. Rogers has a famous quote that says, "Parents and teachers are the most important people in the lives of young people. Therefore, parents and teachers are the most important people in the world." And so I just think that we need to focus on our responsibilities, on the things that we signed up for, that our children did not sign up to be here, and just do the best that we can, and be a lifelong learner, meaning that we can't think we know everything, and we can't think just because we think something is a certain way that it is that way. We need to be informed. We need to know about the facts. We need to know about the research, and then we have to be able to take our own personal story with those things and do our best with it.
That is amazing. Thank you so much. Parents are the most important people in the world. So let's make sure that we're these lifelong learners so that we are building up that skill. Next week, we're going to be covering another live session with Brittany Singh. We're going to dive a little bit more into this equity issue. To me, it's the key issue of our day, and so I keep saying, like, what are the tools that we can do to better support equity? I think that if anything, within AI parenting, we're starting to see these imbalances. We need to switch things to the other side. So we're bringing in all the experts that we can find in this space. And so once again, thank you for everything. We will all speak with you soon, and we love you. We appreciate you. Take care.
Love you too, man. Happy SEL.